My name's Ed Salkield, and it's great to be able to speak to you today. I'm from the Systems Security Lab at the University of Oxford, and I'm going to be presenting Firefly, spoofing Earth observation satellites through radio overshadowing. Now, although satellite data is becoming increasingly important, the thing is that many satellites don't use cryptography to authenticate the downlink, and this opens up the door for spoofing attacks. As James said at the beginning, we know quite well how to eavesdrop satellite systems, and we have a good idea as to what an attacker might do in a passive setting, but we don't currently know the limitations of what we could expect an active spoofing attacker to achieve against real-world downlink systems. For example, we don't know how easy it is for an attacker to transmit their own malicious signal and cause a benevolent ground station to produce malicious data that then gets passed on to other consumers. We also don't know whether the cost to the attacker is worth it and what the hardware required to do this is, or whether existing ground stations can be expected to be robust against modern, motivated, and realistic threats. And that's why in this work we're seeking to address these questions. I'm going to present to you an analysis of the vulnerability and effects of spoofing attacks against current Earth observation systems. The current situation in space is that many satellites don't encrypt the downlink. And this isn't because they're naive. There are actual engineering constraints that have led to these decisions. When you install a cryptographic module, especially historically, you can expect an increased power budget, increased mission complexity, and increased cost on your mission. All of these you want to keep really low. Although we might expect that modern hardware can help deal with these problems, legacy systems still exist, and we need to maintain backwards compatibility with them. And furthermore, there are still other satellite systems that don't encrypt the downlink on purpose in order to make sure that the data is open access. However, there are also satellite systems that do encrypt the downlink, but are now decryptable since their launch. And this is because certain crypto systems that were secure at the time of launch are now no longer secure against modern adversaries. We can take COMS-1, for example, which is a Korean satellite which uses single DES. In addition, keys, especially ones that are master keys and baked into the firmware, can end up getting leaked. For example, GK2A had its keys leaked in some source code that was put up on the operator's website, and the keys are still there to this day. Now, the knock-on consequences from these kinds of unauthenticated satellite downlinks could be quite wide-reaching, and that's what we're going to really investigate in this work, because consumers of this data include use cases such as fire detection and management, as well as many others, such as geospatial intelligence, weather monitoring, infrared sensing, and climate monitoring. And we provide a more detailed analysis of which satellites contribute to which kinds of datasets within the paper. Now, the implications are twofold. Firstly, in terms of data secrecy, we know that an attacker can set up their own receiving hardware, and they can therefore receive these satellite communications if they're within the zone of where the satellite's transmitting. And it's been shown in recent work that only a software-defined radio, and with access to open source software, an attacker can reasonably expect to read confidential maritime data and internet traffic, as well as eavesdrop on systems such as Iridium in order to extract the traffic and calls. However, there are also implications for data authenticity, because an attacker can equivalently set up their own transmission setup and use this transmission to overshadow a legitimate satellite transmission. Then the attacker's data is received at the ground station instead of the victim, and this can go on to cause a number of knock-on consequences. Now, the current work in spoofing attacks is quite limited, but they have been shown to be effective, specifically against GNSS, where attackers can manipulate the calculated location through an approach very similar to this, but also against satellite uplinks, where satellite hijacking can be done on the command and control link, as well as broadcast intrusion on things like satellite television. However, no current work considers the impact of these kinds of overshadowing attacks on Earth observation satellites. Therefore, we formed the following research question. What is it that the attacker can achieve by exploiting the unauthenticated nature of the channel from these specific systems? In order to investigate this further, we sought to put together a threat model. And in particular, the attacker in this scenario is looking to transmit a counterfeit signal within the vicinity of the receiver. And they are wanting to cause one of two potential knock-on consequences. The first is to affect satellite-derived datasets by inserting their own fictitious data that doesn't match the reality of the satellite sensors. The second is to exploit or disrupt the downlink processing stages themselves. This could be through sending data that doesn't even conform to the protocol in such a way that they hope to exploit specific processing stages. Now, in order to achieve these attacks at all, we need to first outline the attacker capabilities. Of course, they're going to require something like a software-defined radio to allow them to output arbitrary signals from their computing hardware. However, there's a unique challenge here, because the frequency range of most software-defined radios sits below a lot of Earth-observing satellite systems. Most software-defined radios can emit frequencies up to about 6 gigahertz or so, but a lot of satellites, especially the Earth-observing ones, are downlinking their data at the X-band, so that's like 8 to 10 gigahertz or above, in the Ku or Ka bands. And therefore, the attacker needs to connect their software-defined radio into suitable up-converting and amplifying hardware. Traditionally, this is quite hard to come across, but work from the amateur radio community has shown that if you're willing to get your hands dirty, you can build very robust and very reliable up-converter hardware on a shoestring budget. So we can assume this for our attacker as a lower bound, and combined with a compatible antenna, we end up with a threat model with a budget of around $3,000, which we think sits within the budget of a motivated hobbyist, and therefore kind of widens the remit of who we could expect to be deploying these kinds of attacks and against these sorts of systems. It is worth underlining that this is potentially a lower bound, but the actual amount will vary depending on the frequency of the system that's being attacked. So as a case study, we sought to analyze FIRMS. This is NASA's Fire Information and Resource Management System. It's a real-time API that takes data from NASA's MODIS instruments as present on the Terra and Aqua satellites and a couple of others in the Earth Observing Systems fleet. And this data is downlinked to a number of different ground stations, which process the data into derived datasets that represent where the forest fires are on the Earth in real time. And it does this by inspecting the infrared channels within the sensor readings. And then these datasets of geolocated fires are passed on to various different consumers of the datasets, where it's used in over 160 countries for purposes such as crisis analysis and dispatching forest fire teams. In order to assess the vulnerability of this kind of system to an attack, we first sought to gain access to the NASA source code for the decoder, and we did. If you go to the URL on the slide to the Direct Readout Laboratory website, you too with an academic account can download it. And the basic idea is it proceeds as follows. The raw radio signal comes into the system where it gets demodulated from QPSK, and this produces bytes. These bytes represent data link layer packets, which themselves are unpacked and contain network layer packets. And these network layer packets contain the packed sensor data in the form of an array that we'll come to later. Now, this data is processed into a higher level data structure by the application layer boxes here, and in particular, Mod 14 SPA, which takes the raw data and converts it into this dataset of where the various live forest fires are. Now, although this processing pipeline is available to decode the data, other than security research, there's no legitimate reason why you'd ever want to really re-encode on the Earth data into this packet format. And that's why we had to build, and we are contributing through this work, a number of different tools and libraries to enable you to decode, validate, and re-encode data of each of these different formats. At the application layer, we contribute libGIS, which allows you to repack the data from these MODIS sensors, that's moderate imaging, moderate resolution infrared spectroscopy, I believe. And you can repack this data using libGIS and then into the network layer packets with libstp and the data link layer packets with libcadu. And so with all of these tools in your toolbox, we're ready to consider an overview of the attack. In essence, we start by obtaining some kind of legitimate data from a data archive and obtaining the downlink decoder software where we performed a security audit. And we were looking in particular to determine any data integrity checks. So if we're inserting our own fictitious data, we know what we need to do to make it look legitimate. Also, we need to identify any vulnerabilities where the software engineers assumed that the data was going to be safe on input, but actually we might be able to take advantage of it in some ways. Once we've done this security audit, we're in place to create maliciously crafted data to insert into the system. And this can either take the case of reprocessing the archived data so that we can add and remove various artifacts, or to construct some kind of payload packet that then triggers a vulnerability chain. And we'll go on to show case studies of both of these. Starting with the first, we're looking to affect the derived dataset. And here we have before us the packet structure of the network layer packets, the kind that you can decode and re-encode with our libSPP. Now, the fields that we're particularly interested in are highlighted in blue just here. To the left, we see metadata, things like packet type and mirror side, which is like which side of the rotating mirror in the instrument the light bounces off before it hits the sensor. Basically, you can combine all of this metadata together to construct a mapping of where exactly sensor reading is on the Earth's surface, given the current setup of the instrument and where the satellite is in orbit. But the actual data is contained within the data field, which is a densely packed array of lots of different sensor readings. And in particular, we're interested in those in the infrared band that correspond to hotspots where there might be forest fires. And Modis mask fires, a tool from libGIS, can be used to manipulate this. This allows us to take data from the distributed archive, such as these sensor readings from the California basin during forest fire season, and either beforehand or in real time mask out the forest fires by stripping up the infrared channels and setting them to 0, or instead to exercise fine-grained control over where the fires get injected. However, there's that other side to the attack that we need to consider, which is in terms of exploiting the decoder. In this, we're focusing on headers like the packet length and the time tag that where the decoder might be assuming certain values, and we can put in different values that violate the protocol in order to cause bad effects at the decoder. We found, and we put in the paper, a vulnerability that we found in terms of packet length. And it's, on one level, a really simple vulnerability. That is that, although this packet is designed to be variable length, all of the packets that are ever transmitted from the Modis instrument are of one of two lengths, one length corresponding to packets of daytime sensor readings and the other of nighttime sensor readings. And as a result, all of the decoder software assumes that we're getting packets of those two lengths. And if you provide a packet of the wrong length, or if you provide a packet length that's longer than the actual length of the packet, then you end up with all sorts of issues in the decoder from that point on. And you can change these packets, these packet fields, using our tool SPPpack from libSPP. This allows you to perform the following rough attack sequence. We take some bytes, in this case, a number of bytes that is not the day or night packet length, and we run it through SPPpack, setting some headers in order to look legitimate and pass the authenticity checks to create a bad packet. We can then concatenate this bad packet onto a good packet sequence from the archive and run it through the processing software, which, when it processes, causes an unrecoverable error in the processing software. This means that the insertion of a single packet is sufficient to take down the processing pipeline and prevents the data from getting through to crisis response. We don't know for sure whether or not, for example, there's another system running above this that will be watching for crashes and restarting, and that's entirely possible. And those are the kinds of questions that we really can't answer without speaking to somebody who's actually running these systems. But it's quite the information around that's quite tight to find. Regardless, it is possible to run these sorts of attacks in practice. And since we uploaded the draft paper, we did find further vulnerabilities in this software as well, which indicates that the issue might be systemic rather than a one-off. So this all raises questions about what can we actually do. Clearly, the first and the most important countermeasure is that we should be requiring cryptography against the data link, because we think that achieving these kinds of spoofing attacks are cheap enough to be a concern, at least of some moderate concern, and also. And also, like, why wouldn't you, considering the cost of cryptographic hardware is coming down quite a lot recently? However, we recognize that some satellite missions will always exist where cryptography isn't viable and existing satellite systems can't be upgraded. And so there's been work in the community into backwards compatible countermeasures that we can use to increase the security of these systems that are already deployed. So one such countermeasure is in multi-receiver data comparison, where you receive the data at multiple different ground stations and you compare This essentially allows you to check whether the data you received is legitimate, but doesn't protect you too much in the decoder exploitation case. You can also do timing analysis by receiving a satellite signal and triangulating where the transmitter must have been and potentially comparing this to the well-known position of the satellite in order to get a measure of data authenticity. You can also get a measure of data authenticity through physical layer fingerprinting, where you look at the artifacts that it imparted on the signal by specific tolerances of the hardware of the transmitter, and you know that the attacker's transmitter must be slightly different to the satellite's, and so you should be able to pick up whether or not it's legitimate this way. In the paper, we analyze these countermeasures in context, and we find that although these existing countermeasures would be very effective, they aren't necessarily viable in all scenarios. In big ground stations, sure, but in smaller embedded devices, such as direct-to-mobile, although we won't probably see that in Earth-observing satellite systems cases. But going more generally, in certain situations, these countermeasures aren't hugely viable due to requiring large computational constraints. So to wrap us up, I'd like to point forward to some future research directions that this research really indicates would be important. We've shown that real-world Earth-observing systems can be vulnerable to these sorts of spoofing attacks, and we think it's therefore important to validate this work against real-world receiver hardware, which we don't really have access to, but it would be a fantastic contribution if it could be done. It would also be great to do a comprehensive review of other vulnerable satellite systems so that we could understand how these spoofing attacks affect, for example, as I mentioned, these direct-to-mobile satellite systems and others beyond just Earth-observing systems. It would also be fantastic to analyze the effectiveness of proposed overshadowing countermeasures in an empirical setting to set up some kind of hardware testbed to try this stuff out. So in conclusion, we've demonstrated that viable spoofing attacks exist against NASA's forest fire detection system, which is a large Earth-observing systems process. And so we expect that this is potentially the trend rather than an exception. We've provided the source code required to manipulate the packet data and structure, which works against this particular system, but parts of it will be generalizable to other systems research too. We've confirmed that only a moderate budget is required to perform these attacks, which does raise the level of concern of this kind of attack. And we've identified several current countermeasures which significantly increase the attack difficulty. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, and I'd like to turn over to any questions.
All right, let's thank the speaker.
Do you think that you can manipulate the packets to not just cause a denial of service, but to possibly point to or cause a more sophisticated attack, such as like taking advantage of software flaws on the base station to maintain persistence at that station, so you can continually monitor the messages getting received?
That's a really good question, and actually something that we considered quite a lot during this research. Obviously, that's the holy grail that we were trying to achieve here. Can we get arbitrary code execution? We weren't able to find an arbitrary code execution vulnerability in this code base through a very extensive security audit, but I think that's sort of because it's a bit like Swiss cheese. There are lots of holes, but there's no one hole all the way from the beginning to the end. And so there were many points, for example, where the input data was passed into some C program, and then the output of that C program passed into the shell, and then that in some Python script. And so there were many opportunities where if only you could get this program to crash in this way, or if only you could get this data to fall over in this way, then the output of that would be passed into the shell and you'd be all good. We found several vulnerabilities that we've reported to NASA through responsible disclosure about, for example, about taking the data from sort of reprocessing archived data and using that to get arbitrary code execution. But we didn't find anything specifically end-to-end. But I think that is the result of kind of, I don't know, it seemed like the software wasn't hugely designed with security in mind. And so I would not be surprised to find that there is such a vulnerability in this code base, or indeed similar other code bases, which really does kind of give us some context for where future research needs to go.
And can you give us an outlook on the physical layer, basically? I mean, that was the only thing that was missing here?
Right, yes. So in order to actually get this to be received at the physical layer, the attacker needs to achieve a gain as received at the receiver that is sufficiently high against the victim signal, such that their signal gets decoded instead of the victim. We didn't do a full in-depth analysis of this physical layer stuff in this paper, but we expect that certain attributes of the signal, such as modulation and encoding, might affect the success of the attack. Also, the attacker has to face, depending on the satellite system, a highly directional dish where signals outside of the main beam are going to be hugely attenuated. And so overcoming these sorts of barriers is going to be critical in actually executing this attack in practice.